Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and here with me is my co-author, my co-host, the mutinied captain of the good ship Lollipop.
Soy Trent.
Soy Trent.
Soy Trent.
I almost said the good ship AI slop. I couldn't decide which of those to go with. I didn't think that would sound right, especially because it wouldn't be good to be on the ship of AI slop.
No, it wouldn't.
So, you think that's what Jeff Bezos named his yacht?
No.
The good ship AI slop?
No, because that's too creative. He probably called it Jeff's Big Yacht.
That's probably true. Too creative, but he's the man who's helping to write Rings of Power.
I know. That explains a lot.
Anyway, this week, the two of us want to explore something that isn't Jeff Bezos. It's instead something we've alluded to across most episodes, but never discussed in depth. That is accessibility. I, as a professor at the University of Connecticut, used to teach an accessibility design course, and it was a fundamental component of the other courses I taught: instructional design, educational technology, even game design. And because of the overlap of all of these things, it makes sense to go back and discuss some of the other topics we've covered, but with a focus on accessibility design. I want to dispel, even before we get into the broader conversation, the notion that disability is about the individual person. You can think of disability in that biomedical model where there is something wrong with a person physically, emotionally, cognitively. And by wrong, I mean not neurotypical, not physiologically able. There are other ways to kind of think about this. But the reason why I veer away from that discussion is because I'm more interested in the social definition of disability, which is about how do environments disable people. Mm-hmm. And instead of thinking about the person as having barriers themselves, thinking about it as the environment creating barriers that make it more difficult for people to interact with those environments or in those environments. That said, I want to dive into the universal design for learning principles, some situated cognition. And Trent, I know you wanted to start things off with an anecdote or an example from our own shared cultural experience that might shape the way we discuss this.
So one of the I would just say that I'm looking forward to having this conversation because I want to learn more about this. I've taken, in all of my years, I've taken exactly one pedagogy class, and then everything else has been sort of self-taught, self-read, stuff like that. So I've got nowhere near the training that you do. But one of the things, so as we've been talking about, and as I've been working in world building, for all these years and thinking about perspective, and this is really for me at least where it comes down to is when we're talking about perspective, you have to take into account lots of different kinds of perspective, right? Mm-hmm. But while we started talking before the show about this, I thought, there's the Yanni and Laurel video where they play the same clip, and some people hear Yanni and some people hear Laurel, and it's the exact same tone. And then there's the gold and purple dress, right? The people couldn't tell if it was black or white or whether it was gold or purple. And you have two people standing right next to each other and they can't agree on what it is, right? And this all is like, okay, well, if our senses are what we are basing our, constructionist learning theory is that you're building a model of the world based on your experiences. And then once you have that sort of epiphany that, hey, wait a minute, like my senses are not correct 100% of the time. There are optical illusions, you can hear things, or like, if you're a witness to a crime or something like that, eyewitness testimonies are different. It's like, okay, so wait a minute. Like once you start backing away from the idea that there is a concrete, objective, knowable world that is out there, and instead saying, well, really what we have is tons and tons and tons of subjective experiences that sort of give us a baseline for what most of us are experiencing, right? Mm-hmm. Then you're just realizing, okay, there's all sorts of stuff on the peripheries that you don't think about if you don't know that it's out there, right? So one of the examples that I would use right off the bat too. I think we want to talk a lot about neurodiversity today too, because I think that's the thing that seems to be really rising. What I'm seeing in my classes, it's whether it's rising or whether we're recognizing it. Who knows? Could be a little bit of both. But also, I worked at the second largest school for deaf students, and I remember going through when I was teaching as a grad student, 5 years or whatever. I don't think I had a single deaf student. And then as soon as I started teaching at RIT, I would have 3 or 4 deaf students in each class. And teaching something like Intro to Creative Writing, where you're teaching poetic language, I really became fascinated by watching the interpreters trying to figure out, negotiate between themselves how to use sort of like the figurative language in ASL, and then take poetic ASL, American Sign
Hmm.
Language, and then translate that back into English. I'm like, this is amazing. Like, this makes me think about language completely differently. This is the same thing when I started off by saying soy Trent. I've been learning Spanish for 5 years, and it's the same thing where I'm at the point now where I'm like, oh, this is not a direct translation. This is how you would say it in Spanish. This is how a native Spaniard would say it, at least somebody, or in some countries, because they all speak different variants of Spanish. But it's the same kind of thing where it's like, okay, you got to get into a different headspace and think about something that you never had to think about before from
Hmm.
another kind of direction. And I was going to say, I think this is why it's a lot of work. It costs, in terms of money, in terms of time, in
Hmm.
terms of thinking, it costs a lot, right? But at the expense of, if you don't do it, then you are willfully eliminating people from the conversation,
Hmm.
or negating their experience, or making them second class citizens, or whatever it is that you want to do, just because, or however you want to put it, just because they're on one periphery or another. And that may be that they're in, like my son is colorblind, and it's like, okay, well, he's in, sort of like the typical kind of group for lots and lots and lots of stuff, but he's colorblind. He's red, green colorblind, right? So that's a kind of accessibility that he would need. He just can't really tell browns and purples, right? So I mean, that's just something that's his reality. He would have, if he'd been the only one on this planet, he would never know that those other colors sort of exist.
Hmm.
So yeah, just sort of throwing that out there and really thinking about, something that I think you've said before, and other educators have said before. There's the IEP, the
Hmm.
individualized education plan, and like in good teaching, every student should have their own IEP, right? Like basically figuring out how can we dial all of this in, still share common knowledge, still bring all of our experiences to the floor, all that kind of stuff, and then take away sort of like a general, yeah, we all kind of agree to this, without it necessarily being this is true, this is false, this is the way it is, and what you're experiencing is a hallucination or something else like that, right? Getting away from all
Hmm.
those kinds of conversations. So having said that, I'll pass it back over to you. Where do you want to start with this conversation? And really, I mean, it's the same. I often have these conversations too about what does it mean for something to be alien, and if something were truly alien, it would be impossible for us to describe, for us to even get our heads around. We don't have language
Hmm.
for it, right? And it's a little bit of that too, where it's like, well, science fiction and fantasy is trying to do some estranging, and I think one of the things that's really interesting by shining light on different kinds of abilities and disabilities, then you start seeing, wait a minute, right? Like there are, not to call people aliens, but it's a different. Maybe we should cut that too.
As
But
somebody who is autistic, I find the alien label perfectly
okay,
reasonable.
there you go, there you go. But yeah, just thinking about how people who are getting by day to day just fine, and but may experiencing aspects of life in very different ways, but then having their own ways of sort of dealing with that, just like I have my I've got my coping mechanisms and things like that. Is it really all that different? So I'll pass it back over to you now. Done rambling.
Oh, Lordy, there's so many things that I want to keep taking down all these different tracks. I think I should start with the situativity of personal experience. We talked in the book about life worlds, and even if you don't like that terminology, just thinking about life experience, right? This idea that different people, as you said, perceive the world differently, which shapes their interpretation of it, which means that they're going to act on it in different ways. And this is one of the things that got me into educational psychology in the first place. So I know we want to have this sort of sprawling conversation about accessibility, but I think you can't disentangle that from situated cognition and this idea that human experience is about the dialectic between yourself and the environment around you, which is one of the reasons why the social model of disability appeals to me.
Hmm.
And I say this too as somebody who I am disabled in various capacities, right? You mentioned your son being colorblind. I have irritable bowel syndrome and I'm autistic, neurodivergent. I also have ADHD. And like the way that I'm processing reality around me manifests differently than it would with somebody who doesn't have the kind of brain chemistry that I have or the kind of gut chemistry that I have.
Yeah.
Those things make a massive difference. And given the environment, I can be more or less functional if I have the right kinds of supports in those environments. That's no different than you wearing your glasses, right?
Yeah.
That
Right.
it's just another way that you utilize some environmental tool to be able to make the dialectic between yourself and that environment manageable.
Right.
So there's a metaphor that anyone who has been involved with the disability community will have heard this a bajillion times, and even some of those of you who haven't. But the idea of having spoons, enough spoons to get through the day. And the idea being if you sit down at a lunch table and you're describing to somebody how many things you can do in a day, everything you do throughout the day is going to consume one spoon that you've laid down in front of you. If you get up in the morning and you take a shower, you've spent a spoon on taking that shower. If you drive into work or you make yourself breakfast, there goes another spoon. So you're spending down the finite energy, resources, physicality, emotional capacity that you have. And the reason why this works so well when you're trying to teach other people about accessibility and accessibility design is because some people don't face that particular kind of environmental barrier. So they need to wrap their head around conceptually, what does it mean if you only have so much health available to you to do the things that you need to do? I found that super compelling the first time that I had heard about it. And I think this came up when we were writing the book. People become disabled as they get older because the environment becomes less and less accessible to you
Right.
due to things like arthritis or dementia or other conditions that sort of cause your body to deteriorate in various ways. Vision is another one, right? Or hearing, put in a hearing aid. All of those things speak to the individual experience of individual people doing their individual lives. And I really, really wanted my students to take away from either the learning theory classes that I was teaching or the accessibility design classes that I was teaching. Everything we do when we're building a curriculum, building a game, needs to accommodate as many people as possible, which just means including lots of available options, thinking about what kinds of people could potentially utilize this resource that I've created or access it, whether that's designing some kind of assessment for a classroom evaluation or building out the tutorial for a video game.
Yeah.
And I do want to specify that it is not particularly helpful if you're doing this design work to think about specific people, like imagining a specific person who has some specific issue with some specific element of the environment. You really want to start at this question of what makes a thing toggleable, what makes a thing choosable, what makes it more like that Roy Rogers buffet style model where everybody's getting the burger on the bun, but you get to decide for yourself what are the fixins I'm going to apply to it. And then creating that environment, adding as many fixins to the fixins bar as you possibly can while dialing back to make sure that the base experience is more or less the same or as similar and standardized as it can be to communicate the thing you want it to communicate. I think a lot about when I talk to students or anyone about accessibility design. One of the students that I had when I was a student teacher, he had a degenerative eye disorder. So his vision was gradually dissipating. He wasn't able to see very much. And he had gone from full vision over the course of his childhood to being able to see through about the equivalent of a coffee stirrer straw. So when he entered my biology classroom, I was teaching high school biology at the time, we had to think really carefully about what are we going to do to communicate biological concepts to a student who's going to have difficulty visualizing them the way that students looking at a slideshow would be able to. That led me to think much more carefully about what good biology education can or should look like in general, and why it's not particularly helpful to build all of our resources in biology education, assuming that students will have the ability to see.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I shouldn't paint with too broad a brush. There are some resources that don't require that. And even if you have something like a written text, you can provide audio. Or if you have video, you can provide closed captioning for somebody who's hard of hearing or deaf. That's not really what I'm talking about. What I'm more interested in is the activities you do in the classroom. How do you have a successful lab experiment with somebody who isn't able to see what they're doing while they're at the lab bench? How do you communicate something like a Punnett square to somebody who's not going to be able to see the capital letters and the lowercase letters, right? So just as two examples of things that we did, one of them was for an enzyme laboratory activity where the students were taking a piece of liver and you're going to use the enzymes to look at how the liver digests different kinds of materials, substrates. That's something that's typically done through a microscope, right? You're taking a little piece of something, putting it on a microscope slide or in a petri dish and trying to do it that way. For this student, what I ended up doing was using temperature as a stand-in for the enzymatic behavior of the liver. And he would put his hand into either hot water or cold water. And the idea being that he would then try to write his name using a hand that was heated up or a hand that was cooled down. And that was supposed to be some kind of stand-in or analog for the basic concept that the students were looking at, which was, is the enzyme causing something to be digested more or less quickly? The other one that I really, really liked was the replacement for the Punnett squares, where we ended up using different kinds of textured materials. So cork and felt and plastic, whatever. And those represented different alleles. What we ended up having him do is every activity that we built for that particular unit involved him getting out the textured material set that we had created and then demonstrating the same skills that the other students were developing in his own way. And that ended up being useful for him as an individual in the classroom who needed to have some additional resource, but it was also useful to the other students who were in the classroom who got this extra modality, which gets to this other topic that I wanted to get to, which is about universal design principles and this notion that the environment can be designed to make multiple different uses of a specific tool that's added to it. So Mike Young and I, when we taught our educational technology course, would refer to curb cuts quite often, or the button you push, the handicap button on the door that makes it open automatically, right? Those things, while designed for a wheelchair user, are also useful for a bunch of other things, like pushing a shopping cart or a baby stroller or anything that needs to get up on the curve that's really big and heavy. So when we're thinking about accessibility design and what that means for world building, I'm usually telling individuals in my own classes that we want to think through what are the available tools that we're utilizing, and is everyone going to be able to access those tools? And if not, what are the parallel tools that we could offer that maybe would accomplish a similar goal with somebody who has different abilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
The same thing is true of physical resources as online resources, as any, social resources. I would argue that you need to think, especially with respect to neurodivergent students, about the kinds of social, emotional, and cognitive resources that accompany anything else you're providing to the entire class.
Yeah, and I think that's where, as you were talking, of course, I was having lots of different ideas. One of which is like I really like the texture idea that the other students in the class could also benefit from learning from that. They probably could learn from the hot water, cold water thing as well. Because like in that class, people are taking biology or intro to biology or whatever it is, and like how many of them are going to go on and use that in their daily lives, become physicians, become lab, doing things with biological stuff in labs. And it's like, well, it's the purpose of education is really to give people a broader understanding of how the world works, right? And it's like, why does biology have to work in this one single, why does comprehension of biological principles need to be delivered in this one way, right? I mean, it's really kind of dumb when you think about it that way. I was also thinking that as we go through life, like I've played soccer my entire life, sprained my ankles, busted my knees, all this kind of stuff. So I spent a good amount of my life on crutches. And it's one of those things that you start realizing when there are ramps, when there are elevators, and when there are not, right? And it's like, oh, well, I'm able-bodied otherwise, right? I could, obviously, if I'm playing soccer, but you get a bad knee injury or something like that and you're on crutches and you got to go up 4 floors and there's no elevator, like that suddenly like is eye-opening to somebody who's never had to deal with that before. And I think that this is where, as we grow older in our Western culture, at least, or at least in the United States, we do start to lose our sight. We do start to lose our hearing, right? There are all these other things that happen physiologically. So why wouldn't you want to create a world that was going to be equally accessible to theoretically anybody, but also to you throughout different stages in your life? What you may or may not need this particular intervention, right? In the way that we're going to change the space. But number one, why is that bad? You know what I mean? Like if you've got some sort of way to make a space more accessible and you never need it, like, okay, why is that such a bad thing? And then it's also like, well, just think about, if I'm not this way, but if you were this way, like, well, what happens if you lose your sight? What happens if you lose your hearing, right? And it's like, oh, well, I would want all those things. Well, of course you would, right? Like, of course you would want to not feel like the world was a welcoming place and everywhere you went, you ran into barriers just trying to live your daily life. So it's like, to me, it's like there is no compelling reason not to do this, other than the sort of twisted, like, there's no way to make money off it. And it's like, well, that shouldn't be the rationale that we choose to do absolutely everything, is whether you can or cannot make money off of it. You meet somebody who's differently abled or whatever however you want to say it, and you start to see, oh, wait a minute, these things that I take for granted all the time create challenges, and it's not like those challenges, it's not like I get a benefit from having, you know what I mean, from having other people challenged by it. So that's just kind of where, thinking about all of this stuff for me, and the way I think about this also is the way of, in a weird connection, like if you read a book when you're 12, you read that book when you're 30, you read that same book when you're 60, it says different things to you, even though the words haven't changed. And I think that, to me at least, makes sense in my mind in this kind of conversation, where it's like, the more that we think that there is that objective thing out there that, we can know without sort of questioning, it's like, well, wait a minute, no, it's much more contingent. Like, that's where all this stuff that we've talked about with world building, it's all really contingent on time and place, and at different times and in different places, you may be a different person experiencing things in different ways. And like you said, I think that the best thing that we can do as good human beings is try to make most situations as accessible for as many different people as possible, right? And maybe it's impossible to do that for absolutely everybody all the time, but why not give it a try? You know what I mean? And I think going through this, it also, I was working with some game design students who were going through all of the different color combinations that you needed to avoid for colorblind gamers, right? And it's like, why is that a bad thing? You know what I mean? Like, it makes you make different choices, and you need to think a little bit differently about your audience and your own design principles. But why is that bad or negative, right? And it really just seems to me to be very sort of short-sighted and, not very brilliant for people to just be like, oh, I don't have those problems, so therefore it's a lot of wasted time and a lot of wasted effort.
I do think that's an interesting capitalistic question in terms of at what point are you potentially expanding an audience versus it becomes too expensive, so I'm just not doing it because the financial reward for doing that is so minimal. There are plenty of really good examples of that in reality, like organizations, pharmaceutical organizations that stopped producing medications because they were no longer profitable. Like
Right.
certain vaccines stopped being available because companies decided there are too few people who will get this particular vaccine, so we're just not going to do it anymore. And even if you leave aside the capitalistic problem, in K-12 educational environments where students frequently do have IEPs or 504 plans, it's not uncommon for schools to assume, well, this student has this specific disability, therefore we're going to give them this specific tool to fix, quote unquote, the disability.
Right.
And often that's going to be the most expensive thing you can imagine because you're only going to know the resources that are available based on who's in the room making that decision. And if
Right.
they are unaware of stuff, they're not going to be able to recommend it, which is why we used to tell our students it was incredibly important that they were the most educated person in that room about what educational or assistive technologies were available to different kinds of learners, not just because we wanted to make sure that every student got the iPad or laptop that they needed, but you needed to know when that wasn't necessary too.
Right.
Because
Right.
school districts have a finite amount of budget. They can't get infinite money for this stuff. And the law does require them to accommodate anyone in the population. That's one of the reasons why I think public schools are a net benefit to society, right?
Hmm.
The challenge for administrators is to figure out how are we doing it in a way that's going to be helpful to the student and also manage the school environment as best we can manage it, which I think includes keeping your budget sustainable,
Yeah.
especially in places that have fundamentally lower school budgets because of the way taxation works or the way that funds are distributed. And this is one of the reasons why it's really dangerous to dismantle the Department of Education, because one of its core functions is to make sure that different school districts have access to funds to be able to assist students who learn differently or have different environmental needs in the school district. Anyway, I bring that up because I wanted to emphasize that there are low tech solutions that are just as good or better than high tech solutions. There are low cost solutions that are just as good or better than high tech solutions. It just means you need to use those things or implement them strategically in the classroom,
Yeah.
not throw everything at a classroom. The same way that you and I discussed this in an earlier episode about interactive whiteboards, that idea that you just bring a projector and a whiteboard and you can do all the app tasks on the white, right? Did that solve a problem or did it just create new problems?
Right.
The same thing is true of accessibility design and universal design. You want to think through what is the wise integration of this thing, not what is the solution to this problem just to get it out of my face.
Yep.
And it's not just about making the school or the classroom environment better, although I think it's that. It's not even just about helping the individual student who has the IEP or 504 plan have a better experience. It's about expanding the breadth of understanding of human experience so that all people can be welcome and included maximally in that environment, whether it's that one student or future students or the broader community. This is one of the reasons why I think this topic just overlaps really nicely with world building because of that someone else's shoes principle, that we want people to think about the world from someone else's perspective. If you are a situated cognitivist, if you think about the world as context dependent and you think about that social model of disability, that's really what world building is all about. It's about expanding to include 100% of different people and make sure that they are represented fairly in the environment that you're trying to construct. And that means you're going to have different people whose perceptual abilities are very different. And it's sort of an old wives' tale thing that there are 5 senses, right? There are tons of different senses. And even the senses that we have are not always similar to other people. You use the example of color blindness, but synesthesia is another one of those categories where you might smell color or you might hear taste, right? There are different ways that different brains are wired, which gets us back to that question about neurodiversity and how different minds can work differently. I know I'm talking about situated cognition and minds in one sentence, but those are different things. Anyway, different kinds of cognition will manifest different kinds of perceptions of reality, which means those interpretations need to be accounted for too. And they're not lesser than or worse than because of the fact that they are different. If anything, I think they're more interesting because of the fact that they create new kinds of ways of understanding, interpreting, and conceptualizing the world, especially when you get to things like creative writing and people are now trying to find ways to cross that barrier the same way that the ASL interpreters were when you talked about creative writing and poetry and all the ways that language can be utilized. when you're transforming it completely from an oral tradition into some actual physical movement of the body.
Right.
And I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I want
Yeah,
to pass
yeah.
it back to you so you can kind of opine on the state of affairs in education
Yeah,
and what
yeah,
all of
yeah.
this means.
Well, as you're talking too, one of the things that really, drives me absolutely nuts. I don't, I mean, I think this is fairly accurate to say that a big problem that we have in the 21st century is that our governments, most big nation building projects or whatever, are kind of 18th century political social philosophy. How can you create a system,
Mm.
right? And
Hmm.
then we build our institutions mostly in the 19th century, like most of the institutions that we have around are from the 19th century, that then have to go through all the technological change of the 20th century. And then none of those things can keep up in the 21st century because they weren't made for the speed of
Hmm.
life. And we're realizing that, hey, when we built things like public schools, we didn't really know how people learned very well, right? But this is the system that we've built over the last 2 centuries or whatever. And by hell or high water, we're going to stick with it. And it's like, okay, but that's not the way. I mean, like, there's no reason why you would need to stick with something that doesn't work because no shame on the people who are trying to figure it out, right? I mean, like, they were building something before that there have been decades of ed psych research and things like that. But it's the same thing like when we get into these questions, like I was talking to somebody about what's going on in the Middle East with Iran, and I was saying, well, you realize that a lot of these countries were carved up by the West post World War II, right? It's like these are not natural things that have always, natural groupings of people and political systems that have always been around. So
Hmm.
why would you think that that is objective? And I think the reason, I mean, this is my long sort of way of getting around to this, is that it's way too hard to think about, wow, if we could go back to it from scratch and rebuild this, right? If we could rewrite our Constitution in the United States to make it benefit from everything we've learned over the last, couple hundred years or whatever, what would we change? As opposed to just thinking like, oh, well, that's just the way it is. That's the way it always has been. This is the best
Hmm.
we can do. And you just got to, and like, it's your problem if you can't get on board with this, right? It's a
Hmm.
completely silly way of looking at the world as opposed to just sort of recognizing that we are always learning as both individuals and as societies. And there's nothing saying that like the way that we're doing things now needed to have been done that way, right? You can look at all sorts of different kind of cultures across the world who built their political systems, all those things very, very differently. But it's really hard, I think, in that if you don't know anybody who's lived in that experience, and basically everyone who's kicking around today, was born in the 20th century, right? So we're talking about however many centuries of human beings and human culture, but we really only have immediate access to maybe the last 50 or so, 60, 70,
Hmm.
somewhere in that range. And I think it's very hard for people to decouple what is real and true versus just what they have always known, right? And this is where something
Hmm.
too, like you can't tell somebody who is born without sight, just try and see harder, right? I mean, that's they will experience the world without vision, and that is it's just a different way of experiencing the world. That if everybody were born without vision, we would have a very different world, right? Like we would have found ways to make sure that people wouldn't fall into holes, and put themselves into danger because we would have adapted very differently. But the
Hmm.
fact is, it's just like, oh, well, sucks to be you kind of, and across all these different ranges of things. And it's like, yeah, that's really kind of a short-sighted, and this is where too, like you think, oh, we're the greatest society has ever been, and we've got more money than ever, and it's like, but really, what are we doing here, right? You know what I mean? Like, shouldn't that be about bringing as many people along as possible, and then also just being able to unlock what those different perspectives can teach you about the world and about experience, and add, that idea again with that world building idea. You're taking your experiences and building views of how the world works. And it's one of those things that, like, having deaf students in my creative writing classes has completely changed the way I think about poetry and language and the way that that works, as has, studying Spanish and realizing that just the cadences and the way that you say things and the order, when you're talking about the flow of time or whatever, it's like, oh, well, English isn't correct. That's just the only thing that I've ever known, right? And other languages
Hmm.
that do it different ways, and that doesn't mean that they're better or worse. It just means it's a different way of experiencing the world. And I'm a big believer in you become more enlightened the more perspectives that you can sort of tap into and sort of
Hmm.
understand. Another one I was working with somebody who was working on a project where they were doing VR, but it would give you stereoscopic vision, like a rabbit with eyes on
Oh
either
yeah.
side of your head, right? And it's like, oh, well, that's how every rabbit has ever lived, right? I mean, unless they had some sort of weird mutation, which they had their eyes forward. But it's like that's the way that they're looking for predators, right? And it's like that's the way that they've evolved. And it's is the way that a rabbit has evolved any better or worse than a human? You know what I mean? When you put it that way, it's a dumb question, right? It's like, well,
Hmm.
we all kind of wound up here the way that we wound up here, and it seems silly to not then recognize there are different ways of interacting quite successfully with the world, right? Or like if you're a bird
Hmm.
and you have flight, you've got the ability to fly, right? I mean, that's something that humans don't naturally have the ability to fly. Are we disabled because we don't have the ability to fly? It's like, well, no one talks about it in that term, right? No one talks about it in those terms. It's just something that birds can do that we can't. But I guess if we start electing birds, maybe then we'll see that like, you can only get to the good restaurants that are up in the tops of trees or something.
Are there good restaurants in the tops of trees?
If the once the birds are in charge, Steve, there will be.
Oh, right. When the corvids take over,
Right, exactly.
we'll be
Exactly.
sitting pretty. I think there is an interesting distinction between how people think about physical disability versus emotional or cognitive disability.
Hmm.
And this is one of the topics that you and I have been discussing somewhat recently because of the fact that RIT as an institution has tried to invite in more students who are neurodiverse, whether that's ADHD or autistic or any other form of
Hmm.
neurodiversity. And on one hand, shouldn't we have been doing this the whole time? Like, shouldn't
Yeah.
we have been reaching out to different people to get their perspectives the whole time? But as you said, memories are stuck in the last 200 years worth of institutional construction.
Yeah.
So we tend to think about school and the way that we bring students into a classroom as being based on that 19th
Yep.
century, 20th century model.
Yeah, and just to throw that in there too, the overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly, fully ably bodied or whatever. And those assumptions are then baked into all of
Mhm.
those institutions.
There was something you said earlier about whether somebody feels as though they have advantage by somebody else not being able to do something. It goes back to that conversation we had back in the episode about demographics regarding privilege and how different people
Yeah.
understand what privilege is, and that some people see everything as zero sum versus other people who understand it that a rising tide lifts all boats. I'm obviously, and I think you are too, in the rising tide lifts all boats category. And when it comes to neurodiversity, if an institution is going to invite those students in and try to make maximally inclusive environments, that means rethinking what classroom instruction looks like and
Right.
how it is organized, because it's not going to be enough to say, well, this student has a need for longer test times. You need to provide an accommodation for more test time. That's not going to cut it. Like there are all these other institutional elements that have to be reconfigured to make those spaces inclusive and accessible to those individuals.
Yeah.
And I think this has changed quite a bit since I was in a teacher education program myself. It was not uncommon for those courses when they talked about special education to say you should make an easier version of the test or
Hmm.
you should change some of your multiple choice questions. That's a really impoverished way of thinking about
Yeah.
inclusivity and accessibility,
Yeah.
right? It's not just that in and of itself isn't going to be enough to say, did the student grow in some way over the course of the semester? Did they learn something they didn't know before? Are they asking better questions at the end of the semester than when they started? And are they coming out
Yeah.
sort of socially and emotionally more healthy than they were when they started the semester, at least with respect to their experience in my classroom environment? And
Right.
so all of those different things play into how are you going to scaffold the activities you're going to do, and then how are you going to measure whether or not learners succeeded underneath the set of criterion that made the most sense for them.
Yeah.
And a lot of people get really uncomfortable about this because they assume then, well, what's the point of testing anyone if everybody just gets to get an A? We talked about this in the assessment episode as well. This notion that some people believe that if you change the grading schema that we utilize as a society, that means suddenly there is no such thing as evaluation.
Right. Right. There is
Just
no rigor.
rampant
Right.
anarchy, right? You can't
Yeah.
have rigor. What I'm saying is that that is not a valid construct in the world I am describing, right?
Right.
That measurement, that efficiency, that rigor, those words stop meaning anything when you switch to a system that is more individualized and designed to help those individual learners figure out what are their strengths, where are their deficits, how can you make the environment better for those kinds of individuals so that they can work more closely with the other students or as closely as possible.
Yeah.
It's just a very fundamentally different way of thinking about it. It's more egalitarian and more socially organized as opposed to the individualistic, every person for themselves. If you get an A, you get to go to Harvard, and if you don't, you get to go
To
right.
UConn. Yeah.
Yeah, they get to go to UConn, right?
Wah, wah. Yeah, I was thinking too, like while you were talking, like, and I think this is where I always try and bring it back to things that now we look at and be like, well, of course, we should have always been doing that, right? So we were just talking, I think it was with my mother-in-law or somebody who was left-handed and went to a Catholic school, and the nuns used to smack their left hand with the ruler because they had to write with the right hand, because if you write cursive in ink with your left hand, then it like bleeds over the page. And it's like, so this is a pretty straight up example of a specific technology being, a pen or a pencil that is being written in a way that, you're going from top left to right that is incompatible with a left hand, right? With the left-handed writing. It's like, okay, but once you get to typing, that no longer matters at all, right? Like that, it doesn't matter at all, right? And there's lots of different ways that you could figure out how to communicate, but it's like, oh, well, no, because most people, the majority of people are right-handed. The answer obviously is to smack left-handed people with a ruler and force them to write right-handed, right? Like that's just a dumb thing. The other thing, and this is, I don't think anybody in their right mind would probably consider this sort of like an ability thing, but once you have kids, right, it's one of those things that when you're walking around, like I've got 2 kids, I know you don't have any, and when you're walking around the mall or whatever, and you got to change a diaper, right? It's like, well, where's there a diaper changing station? And it's like, well, is it woke to have a diaper changing station because a parent needs to change their kid's diaper? Well, if you're in lots of places where they're just not around, right? And it's like, why aren't they around? Because we're here with our kids. Even in the, when I had my first son in 2009, there were still plenty of places that only had baby changing stations in the women's bathroom, right? And it's like, that necessitated my wife to go do the change, the diaper change or whatever. And it's like, again, these are not things that are, descended from heaven and have always existed. It is a patriarchal sort of masculinist thing that says we don't need baby changing tables. Number one, babies don't belong in this space. And then grudgingly, I guess if babies are going to be in this space and we need to have a baby changing table, or maybe it's even that the women are going to be allowed into this space and babies are attached to women. And therefore we need to put baby changing stations in women's restrooms or whatever. It's like all of these chains of assumptions that are all faulty, stemming from the big assumption to begin with is that all kinds of humans are not supposed to be in the state capitol or whatever it is, right? I mean, it's supposed to be, professional men who are supposed to be there, and they don't have to worry about baby changing stations or lactation stations or whatever because they don't have that issue. And it's like, wait a minute. We've created this whole system sort of arbitrarily based on things that we now know are oversights and dumb. And now that we're trying to address them, people push back and they're, we don't really need to wait. It's like, what are you thinking, right? I mean, these are things in which everybody, you get far enough along and it's like, well, of course there are people who are in these situations. And of course it is, barbaric to not have thought about those things, right? But this is where, to me, it's just always like, of course there is the question of time and money, and convenience and all that other kind of thing. But that's where, I think one of the things too that always sort of comes to mind because it drives me absolutely nuts is this whole emphasis on efficiency in all things all the time. And it's like, there are a lot of things that just shouldn't be efficient. And if we've got different kinds of ways of engaging with the world that are perhaps even deliberately not efficient or inefficient, then the assumption that efficiency is always good is just that. It's an assumption, right? And it's an assumption that it is based on you're going to produce more, you're going to do it faster, you're going to make more, you're going to get more profit, or whatever it is. And it's like, okay, but that's like one model. That isn't the best. Like, is that how a rabbit looks at the world, right? You know what I mean? Like, why would it be any, I don't know, it's getting maybe a little bit far afield into like, whatever post.
This is where I think the sort of radical empathy that we're preaching throughout this book comes in. And it's one of the reasons why, as I said earlier, there is this if you were to think about world building and you were to think about discussion about universal design or accessibility, it's like a perfect circle because you can analyze a world with the world building template as a way to evaluate, is it accessible to all people? What kinds of people are oppressed or are supported in the society? Why is that the case? You could do a whole historical review of that society, real or fictional. But this is a thing that designers and educators have to do all the time anyway, or should be doing all the time anyway, because there are real implications, there are real consequences as a result of the way we choose to interpret and behave in those environments or structure those environments. So every single teacher is simultaneously doing the world building process as they evaluate their own classroom. And when I say teacher, I mean that pretty loosely, including like corporate trainers, anyone who's doing any instruction.
Any instruction, yeah.
You're doing that deliberately in some way that is going to manifest as a result of the politics, the economics, the social standards, the culture that you're embedded in. And you're going to be potentially asking your learners to do that same evaluation of themselves or that environment. So there is this sort of 2 birds, 1 stone thing happening here, where if you're doing accessibility design properly, you are actually engaging in the world building process And by doing the world building process, you're asking your students to think more carefully about accessibility.
Right,
So they
right.
just go hand in hand in a way that I think is one of the benefits of teaching this way, because you're
Hmm.
causing your students in an ideal world to think more about the people who are unlike them, and then go out into the world and create things or do things that are going to make the environment more inclusive of everybody. Like you said,
Hmm.
with respect to changing tables, that is a deliberate choice, and we can help students understand that system better so that they can go and help fix those broken systems.
Yeah, yeah. And that's where, I mean, one of the things that I've ridden this hobby horse for a while now, too. We hear all the time that students are less prepared for their entry level jobs or whatever when they go into the corporate world or the workforce or whatever. And I have a strong suspicion that what has happened since the 80s, 90s, whatever, since people started paying attention, is that
Mhm.
Gen X, probably the first group, but millennials definitely, we're seeing things like, oh, I've been now trained to be a critical thinker, and I can see that these hiring practices are racist or they are sexist, and we need to
Mhm.
change them, right? And that doesn't benefit the business in any financial sense, right? Like it's like, oh,
Mhm.
we need to stop this because it's unfair. It is giving, an unfair advantage to certain people and disadvantaging other people, and they're all just rules that we've made, right? And
Mhm.
I really think that that's where all of this backlash against the humanities, particularly liberal arts and humanities, social sciences, part of it is coming from is the fact that people are now saying we've built all of these unjust systems that we need to now unmake or make more accessible to more types of people. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about race or gender or religion or sexuality or whatever it is, right? Like there have been people who've been historically shut out, and people are realizing that's not a great way to build a society. And
Mhm.
when you've got, I mean, this is me going on my little, rant or whatever, but it's like, oh, well, if changing those things isn't efficient and isn't going to bring in more money, then we're not going to do it. And it's like, well, why are we using that as the basis of what we are or aren't supposed to be doing is whether it's efficient and makes more money. It's one of those things where younger generations come in and all they do is they point out all the things that were wrong with the place rather than just shutting up and doing their jobs. And it's like, well, if we're trying to make a better society, a more just, more egalitarian society, then that's what you need to do. And we all should be better off paying, or we should all be wanting to pay that bill to make sure that it's
Mhm.
better for everybody. But it just so far, we're still very much entrenched in that this is the way it's always been, and we don't need to change for a couple people who are complaining, right? It's like that's the way that
Mhm.
so much of this is framed, as opposed to there are varieties of ways of experiencing the world, and we should be trying to incorporate. When we're teaching or when we're just experiencing the world, we should make those experiences as open to as many people as possible. So yeah, so I mean, and it's a question that I think is easier to not be answered in a lot of ways than it is to kind of address it head on, which is why I think in this moment we're such champs in the United States at just being like, none of this matters anymore. We're just going to get back to business rather than trying to say like, let's make a better society. Let's make things that, more people are involved from all sorts of different backgrounds.
All of this is made up and the points don't matter.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
the
It's
physical
all made
reality
up. Yep.
exists. So just focus on the fact that the physical reality exists. And this is why I often struggle with how do you persuade someone who is in an information ecosystem or an environment that's just going to reinforce their priors on this notion that the system that was created 200 years ago has to stay in place because that's
Right.
the best system there is. Because you can't disentangle the fact that all of these injustices that are being identified by the youth, quote unquote,
Yeah.
right? That these are just things that are fundamentally true about reality, and the propaganda or bad faith argumentation or disinformation or whatever that's reinforcing the notion that those old systems are correct is actually just making everything worse for everyone all the time for
Right,
no reason.
exactly. Well, that's the other part too. That when you were talking about a little while ago, I can't remember what exactly you were talking about, but I was thinking that is before when we just get into sort of the physical kind of aspect of this. This is before you even start layering on the culture, or you know what I mean? Like, what does it mean to
Mhm.
have a certain either a certain neuroatypical or whatever it is? Well, what does that mean when you start adding different layers? If you're from a Latin American country, or from an Asian country, or you're from a sub-Saharan African country. I mean, like, though, or like, I was thinking too, while we were talking, this is getting a little bit scatterbrained, but what's new? But people who evolved and have lived in desert regions for hundreds and hundreds of years have different ways of approaching problems and situations and housing, and all that kind of stuff. The people who lived in really, really dense jungles. I remember doing a reading in graduate school that was saying, if you are a human whose, group of people are living in very, very dense jungle areas, vision no longer is the primary thing that you need because you can't see very far in a super dense jungle. So then it's not that you get super, it's not like your ears and your other senses get like super, charged or whatever. But it's like, oh, well, now you got to use those more because your sight is only providing some of the information. Whereas, maybe if you're living in a desert, it is more important, to be able to see over far distances or things like that. And neither one of those is necessarily right or wrong, but you'd want to, I mean, this is, I guess, the bigger picture. Maybe I'm totally rambling here, but I would think that you would want to be able to educate someone from the desert what it's like to live in a jungle and someone from the jungle what it's like to live like in the desert, right? Because either both perfectly natural, normal ways that people have lived and they cope in different ways, right? But we're all more or less the same sort of biological material, right? But it's, culture and all those other things get layered on top and what we deem as good or bad as opposed to what is just sort of an experience that can be validated in some way or shared with somebody else that makes sense versus things that we're just going to pretend that you're just being difficult if you don't experience the world in this way, right? Like you're a problem to be solved. And thinking about, history of medicine as well, and like how long have human beings been on this planet and how long have we had glasses, and things like, all sorts of different little things that we just kind of take for granted. And it's like, oh, well, most of humanity didn't have that benefit and somehow we got here, you know what I mean? So it's like, I think if I could put something as one of the sort of core things we've been talking about since the beginning, it's this oversimplification that is something that we need to keep coming back to and keep addressing because the complexity goes on for an infinite, you know what I mean? Like it's just infinite. So at some point you do need to be able to say, look, we're not going to be able to, accommodate 100% of all possibilities or whatever, because that's just not feasible, right? But it is totally feasible to be like, okay, well, let's take into account the things that we now know exist, that people are experiencing the world in different ways that they didn't even know 100 years ago, and validate that and just accept it and don't put a value judgment on it and just say, we're going to make these spaces more accessible. To me, as, the good sort of leftist liberal that I am, I think, oh, well, you should. A just society would be just, I mean, by definition, would need to be just for everybody, right? Not just the in-group. And so it does, and I mean, it's one of those things too, like the idea that, in my high school, they took the kids that, the special ed kids and put them in the back, and occasionally, you may bump into the hall, bump into some of them during the halls or whatever, but it's very much something to be kept away, right? And it's just so weird that it's like, that's an experience, you know what I mean? Like that's an experience that we will have with different people throughout our entire lives in different environments at the mall and the grocery store, whatever. So why are we doing that? Right? Why are we artificially separating? And it's one thing if it's meant for differing needs and differing help, and it's another thing if it's like we need to punish this or we need to fix it or we just need to get it out of vision so we don't need to worry about it, right? Which I think is the much more nefarious. It's one thing to say we're going to take all of these students who have the same sets of abilities and teach them specifically, mechanisms and strategies that they can use to be successful. That's a good thing, right? But a bad thing is being like, oh, well, we're just going to lump this group together because we don't know what to do with them. And we're going to make sure that they're out of sight because it seems unhealthy. It seems like a failure that there would be that these people would exist. And it's again, it's just sort of like a weird diseased mentality that we should be getting over by the 21st century rather than being, it's almost like superstition. You know what I mean? To me, it feels like just kind of a dumb superstition that, if you had been dealt a different hand or, if you get into a car accident or something and you lose the ability to walk, well, all of a sudden your interest in accessibility is going to go way up, right? And it's like, well, can you do that with maybe not getting hit by a car? You know what I mean? Like it doesn't seem like that's that big of an ask, but in this world, in our current political climate, it seems like asking anybody to think about anyone who's not identical to them or is not pretending to be identical to them is something that is absolutely intolerable. We cannot do that.
what that makes me want to do is give some practical advice to anyone who's been listening to this and thinking, okay, so that's all well and good, but what are we actually supposed to do if we're
Yeah.
using world building in a classroom? How are we supposed to accommodate everyone or as many people as possible? What do we do about the fact that society has not done a particularly good job helping us get our classrooms organized this way? I think the first starting point is much the same way we've talked about with assessment and instructional design previously. You probably just need to figure out how can you localize this to your teaching and learning environment, because the system probably isn't going to help you from the top down. You're going to have to go from the bottom up, which means do some exploration of different resources that are out there that can potentially help you with some of these specific design processes. My students, when I was teaching game design, had the opportunity to join the Able Gamers Association's course on accessibility design, which was largely about the concepts we've been talking about, right? Just giving some awareness of the social definition of disability and how to think more broadly about the human experience, not just isolate it to your specific version of it, but rather the broader scope of different kinds of people interacting in different ways. There's a great resource on YouTube called the Game Maker's Toolkit. So if you're interested in some technological applications that you can bring into your classroom, there are multiple different videos he's created about different kinds of disability and ways that you can accommodate them in the process of game design specifically, but that are useful in other contexts as well. So I used to have my teachers watch those videos because they largely could draw one for one out of them. Here's something I can do. Closed captioning is a really good example of that, right? If
Yep.
you're going to have students watch a video, make sure it has accurate closed captioning. There are other things as well. So when I'm talking with my team at work and we're thinking about accessibility and inclusivity, we'll focus on, can you speed up or slow down the playback speed of something, whether it's audio, video, whatever, so that individuals who are learning very quickly can accelerate, or people who need more time can decelerate, or just the opportunity to go back and repeat something. This is obviously much more challenging if you have a lot of students that you're attending to all at once. So if you're teaching a lecture at a university, this is going to look quite a bit different than if you are running a small course with 8 students in a 7th grade classroom. So you kind of need to adapt based on your specific environment. But big picture, what you want to do is make sure that any resources that you're incorporating into that class have all of these accessibility features available to all students. And much like with video games and the way that they're designed, you want to make sure that there are multiple modalities that somebody can engage with. So if you want to solve a problem, there are multiple ways to solve that problem, not one specific one. That can mean something physical in the environment in terms of participating in a lab activity, as I kind of discussed earlier with respect to the student that I taught who was losing his vision. But that could also be things that are social, emotional, or intellectual. Basically, how are you going to make multiple different opportunities for somebody to communicate if they're not someone who feels comfortable speaking out in a space around a lot of other people? So for example, I use in my classrooms, whether that's in corporate training or in a university or K-12 environment, I would try to maintain some kind of synchronous text-based communication platform. When I was teaching my lectures, I would have Discord for a class. So the given students in that room would be part of that Discord, and I would keep it open on the desk alongside my talking. So if somebody had a question and they didn't want to raise their hand, they could add to the conversation in their own way. I do the same thing when I'm presenting for groups of people in a corporate setting, where if there are 50 or 100 or 300 people, I like having the text chat open because I can get feedback from the audience about what they need in that moment. So if somebody says, I missed that, can you go back? Or they have a question about something and they need more clarification. Again, it's one of those things that, yes, it's useful to an individual who might be shy or have anxiety. It's also just useful to everyone because it creates a written record of what was happening during the class. So that's one opportunity for you as an educator to think about, how am I having those students communicate, and is this really accessible to as many people as possible? I think having an online asynchronous chat is just as useful. So even if you don't maintain a live synchronous chat in that classroom environment, maybe you do create a discussion board or some other online space like Discord or Slack, where your students are going to be able to ask those questions, get involved with one another, share other kinds of media that maybe weren't included, or share media that are going to give more contour to their specific experience with the environment. Because again, one of the benefits of teaching at all is that you have this room full of people who all see the world differently and are going to be able to use different kinds of visual cues or lectures or articles, or, you know, name your favorite kind of resource. They're going to be able to share with the other people in that room what the world looks like to them.
Right. Which
So,
is very different than learning styles, right? Which is the
yes. Yeah, I don't remember if we even talked about learning styles at any point.
The less you talk about it, the better. But if you want to give it, if you want to do a quick takedown, because I mean that's basically I think people get the two things confused. I'm a visual learner, right? So therefore,
So, I mean, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, and I think we did mention this in a previous episode, but learning styles are kind of bullshit. Like the original research on learning styles isn't bad or wrong, but the interpretation of what learning styles means has
The
taken on its life
implementation,
of its
yeah,
own. Yeah,
yeah.
it's a really bad simplification of what the original research was talking about. So I mean, I'm sure you've probably heard about this, but learning styles in the main, in the popular psych culture, is basically some people learn best visually, some learn best auditorily, some learn best kinesthetically. So some people like having lectures and some people like having some physical activity, right? And so therefore you must teach in all of those modalities all the time to make sure all students are accounted for. That's not a strategic or wise integration of technology or pedagogy. Like
Hmm.
the alternative to that way of thinking is there are all of these different ways people perceive. Can I provide multiple different opportunities for people to engage in different ways? If you are somebody who is a much stronger lecturer than you are coming up with some physical activity to do in the classroom, learning styles makes it sound like you need to figure out how am I going to do
Yeah,
all the
yeah.
different learning styles equally well or whatever. That's not really what we are suggesting. We're suggesting that you just think about carefully when you're constructing a curriculum, how are there different spaces for different kinds of learners to engage? And importantly, because this is the part I think gets sort of drilled into people either through pop psych or through teacher education, unfortunately, people have learning preferences. That doesn't mean they can't learn through different
Two different
modalities, right?
modalities, yeah.
And so those are two different things, the preference versus the you must do this in order to accommodate all people.
Yeah, the big thing too that I'm a big fan of and have been doing this for a long time ever since I kind of got wind of it. It's big in sort of the media studies, composition kind of thing. Is also saying why do you need to write a paper like a traditional paper if you can demonstrate that you've mastered the material or you comprehend the material and you can do that in a short video or you could do that in an infographic or you could do that in a
Mm-hmm.
variety of different ways because there are certain people like I've always been somebody who likes to write and it comes very easily for me, so I've never had a problem with kind of long form written answers. Well, that's for me. I'm terrible at taking standardized tests, right? So it's that
Mm-hmm.
same kind of thing where it's like, well, standardized tests, especially when you're dealing with efficiency, are much more efficient than grading or assessing long form written assignments. And that's the only reason why they're used. They're not used because they're superior. They're used because they're more efficient. The other
Mm-hmm.
thing I wanted to throw in here too, because we're coming to the end here, is that I've been using this phrase quite a bit. I, as an educator, I am sick and tired of having to come up with individual responses and individual solutions to institutional and systemic problems, right? So this is where,
Mm-hmm.
and I think this is a big thing for accessibility is that we keep being told, now you got to do this, now you got to do this, now you got to do this, right? We're going to be bringing more different types of neurodiverse students, and you get, like blah, 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 with no training, with no additional resources, with no additional time, right? It's like just you have to do it now. It's really, really hard. And it's one of those things where my feeling is it's institutions that are then basically safeguarding themselves against litigation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like it's an individual professor's fault, not like the entire institution of education's fault that these
Mm-hmm.
things are this way. And now, of course, and this happens, I've got friends that teach, first, second grade or whatever, and it's happening at all of these levels where it's just an impoverished environment for educators where it's like, oh, well, the only way that you can deal with this is by putting in more time, putting in more effort, and doing these things. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that we all who are interested in this, not even if you're not an educator, if you're just interested in an educated public, is advocating for more resources, more time, more educator, bringing down student to teacher ratios, right? All of this kind of stuff that would improve education. It wouldn't necessarily make it much more efficient, but man, would it make it a lot better, right? And it's like, so
Mm-hmm.
let's just not get into efficiency, right? Like we only have 9 months to get through these materials. You know what I mean? It's all arbitrary and stupid, and we're rewarding the people who happen to work in that system better rather than having it like actually be based on, metrics of success or whatever it is that people, can demonstrate they can do at the end of a year, at the end of a unit or something like that.
That just reminded me of something I meant to say earlier, and then I got off track on a different topic. But we already differentiate for other kinds of students. We just don't label it the same way as
Yeah.
creating accessible environments. And I was one of those kids who was tracked into a gifted
I was
program
just, yeah, exactly.
because I was good at school. But it turns out that school, or at least the praise that came along with being good at school, was my special interest. And
Yeah.
so I wanted to be good at school because I wanted people in positions of power or authority to like me. I wanted my parents to be happy. I wanted to impress my teachers. I wanted to, I mean, eventually you get to sort of the behavioral reinforcement of getting awards and getting
Yeah.
good grades. And all of that was good for me. But I also was very lucky to have been put in a classroom where I got to do basically whatever I wanted, and it was effectively a Montessori experience, right? And I
Hmm.
say do whatever I wanted. I wasn't like burning down the classroom, but it was more of a, what do I want to read? What do I
Yeah.
want to work on? What kind
Yeah.
of project do I want to do? And I have fond memories of working with my parents to create, especially my dad, to create this alien puppet show and being able to do that as a project while everybody else is doing their written paper, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that to me epitomizes why it's so important to provide those opportunities to everyone and not
Right.
just the
Exactly.
select few we've decided are smart enough that they can do this.
Yep.
Because meanwhile, I was disabled in a bunch of other ways that were
Yeah.
unrelated to my ability to function at school. I was socially disabled and I had communication issues
Yeah.
because I didn't realize I was autistic, and the way that I behaved socially was affecting other people differently than if I were neurotypical. And
Yeah.
I think I've said this before on the podcast, but there was a point when I was in seventh grade where one of the people I was in school with came up to me and said, "Why do you sound like a robot?" And I didn't know I sounded like a robot until she said that. And then suddenly I had to learn how to mask. And so there are all of these ways that we treat students as being special ed versus
Right.
gifted versus whatever your name is for the traditional kind of classroom. That gets blown apart as soon as you start thinking about all the different ways that different students interact with an environment. And we shouldn't be isolating people based on whether we think they belong in the gifted track or the
Yeah.
special ed track or
Yeah.
whatever. We should be thinking about how do you cross integrate all of those communities so that they can understand, so that number one, everybody can learn equally or has an equal shot at learning. Number two, everybody is getting assessed fairly based on their ability level and the kinds of content they can produce. And then number three, how are we thinking about the dynamism or differentiation of the kinds of activities we're incorporating that are going to highlight different ways of thinking about the world so that everybody comes out of their educational experience a little bit wiser and able to help society in a way that isn't so cut off and assuming that individual ability is the only thing that actually matters, right? The
Right.
social contract needs to be reinforced by helping people understand that other people are the main character too.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way of putting it. That's right. My own, I think we talked about this earlier, but I've got my own ADHD and go when I get obsessed about things. I went for 2 years and listened to nothing but Bob Dylan. I read like, once I started getting into Greek tragedies, I'm like, do I need to learn Greek so I can, read, excerpts of the ones that weren't entirely found or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And it's, at the end of the day, when I graduated high school, I had a 3.0 because I got A's in English language arts and, history because I like stories and storytelling and people and drama and all that kind of stuff. And I'd get C's in math and science. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
through my entire time, K through 12, I was just told, why don't you try as hard in math and science as you do in, your history and in your English classes? And it's like, only many decades later do I realize that was the
Mm-hmm.
dumbest, that was not an enlightened, yeah, it was, Green Bay, Wisconsin in the 1970s and 80s or whatever. So I don't think it was on the forefront of much of anything. Even the Packers were bad back then. But yeah, it's just one of those things where it's like I was made to feel, and this is a very mild kind of case, right? You know what I mean? Again, it's like straight white guy, problems or whatever. But it's like it's a mild case of being told you're deficient in some way,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you cannot do these things. I also had older brothers who could do it across the board. So then instead of being like, wow, and this is where I want to, I'd love to go back and just be like, oh, you remember me? Yeah, from third grade or whatever. Well, now I'm an English professor who writes fiction, and writes books and whatever. And it's like, remember how you thought I was, gonna never amount to much because I didn't have the concentration or whatever, where I was always being a class clown or whatever. But of course, the world doesn't sort of, work like that. But I think that that's where, for me, that the root is always coming back to empathy, thinking about what if I were in somebody else's shoes. And then I think the important part with that, and this is something that I think we mentioned when we were talking about role playing, is actually talking to people who live that experience and seeing if
Mm-hmm.
your suppositions or what your assumptions are actually correct. Right? Because I think this is also where we can go really wrong. Like it would be terrible to have this or to suffer from that. It's just something that they learn to sort of deal with. And then it gives you the opportunity to learn about other ways of navigating the world that you never thought about before, which is a
Mm-hmm.
bonus, which is a benefit, right? That's a good thing, not something that is, flaw or, why do I need to learn that? That's maybe my hippy dippy can't we all get along kind of
How
thing.
dare you care about other
How
people? It's
dare we?
disgusting. I can't believe you.
This is what we're gonna.
How
I can't beat this rap of like being a positive. You're
it
so
is very
optimistic and
funny.
positive, and it's like, yeah, no,
I
it's
think there's the difference between believing all of this stuff in your heart of hearts, knowing that this is what's quote unquote true about
true.
humanity as a species, as a group of organisms on this small rock hurtling around the sun, and then the realities of, oh, but all the bad systems are still in place,
All
and
the yeah,
we haven't put people into positions of power who actually care about any of this and will do the things necessary to fix them. So like
exactly.
I think we can hold both of those thoughts
Yeah.
simultaneously.
The silver lining is we've learned so much about how to teach people and how people learn, but then the ugly sludge part is we set up our institutions to not do that at all, and then
Yes.
trying to build the will for people to actually change those institutions when there are so many vested interests and so many vested moneyed interests in a culture that prizes efficiency, and all these other things. That's the part where it's like, all right, hand me the Johnny Walker. I need to self-medicate.
On that optimistic note,
Yeah.
I did want to recommend a couple of resources to people because if you're interested in this topic and you do want to explore accessibility design a little bit more closely than we were able to get into in the last hour and change, I would start with the National Center for Learning Disabilities framework. They have a publication, I'll call it, called Forward Together, Helping Educators Unlock the Power of Students Who Learn Differently. And that essentially walks you through how different teachers have tried to address some of these issues institutionally, what kinds of things you can do as an individual that are going to make your classroom more accessible. And again, this is something that I think is applicable not just to K-12 education, but to higher
Yeah,
education, where
absolutely.
frequently I would say almost always, faculty are not trained on how to do any of this stuff. So if you're in history or physics or name your domain, you might not have never have gotten accessibility design training, and this could be a good opportunity to dig through and say, oh, well, here are some easy opportunities for me to incorporate this stuff into my classroom. I would also recommend looking into the anchored instruction research from the late 1980s and early 1990s with John Bransford and the Cognition and Technology Group at Vanderbilt. A lot of that is driven toward inquiry-based instruction and why it's good to have these sort of narratives that help students understand and ground their learning. But the reason why I recommend it in the context of accessibility is because those specific projects, and the Adventures of Jasper Woodbury is the main one, the real benefit of inquiry-driven instruction is that it is open-ended by its very nature. So different kinds of learners can produce different kinds of projects in response. They can come up with different kinds of solutions. And it really does depend on their perspective, right? There are a bunch of different ways they can incorporate themselves into that work. So again, John Bransford and the Cognition and Technology Group at Vanderbilt. And I had mentioned this earlier, but also check out Able Gamers, which is an organization that is centered on trying to make game design as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, not just the design process, but also the way games are designed so that different kinds of people can interact with them. And Steve Saylor is a content creator and accessibility consultant in the video game industry. He has a YouTube channel where he evaluates different kinds of games for their accessibility standards and how well they're incorporating those. So I strongly recommend giving him a look. He's a smart guy, has a lot of interesting things to say. And then for those of you in education, I should do a shout out to Anya Evmenova, who is the Associate Dean of Research for the College of Education and Human Development at George Mason. She's a nationally recognized special education and accessibility design scholar, and I think it's worth going and pursuing some of her work. She has a bunch of interesting publications. Her research interests are all kinds of technology integration stuff relating to how you can make your classroom as accessible as possible. So yeah, those are my plugs for people and organizations and resources. Please
Yeah,
go check them out.
I would just say too, because we're getting a little long here when I end it, but I just want to say too that I'm learning this stuff daily, day to day. You know what I mean? You have a new type of student enters your room, and it's like, oh, I've never had to design a class around someone who experiences the world in this way. And I'm sure I make lots of mistakes, and I try and do a lot of listening, and I try and apologize, and then say I'll do better next time. And I think that's really, if you've not had a lot of training, if you've got two options. Option one is pretend there is an objective truth that you're going to use as a hammer and smash everybody's head in if they don't follow it. or be I'll use the term, a good human, and recognize that you don't need to know everything, and that we learn from each other all the time. As somebody who's a professor, I learn from teenagers all the time because the world is a big, confusing, complicated place, and we're better and we're richer for it. So I think that's where, for a lot of this, for me at least, it's not discouraging or it's not frustrating. It's an opportunity to learn more about how to be a better teacher and how to connect, and even on that, how to connect better with other human beings, which is why I'm a teacher. And that's where, and if you get it wrong, then try and, figure out what you did wrong, why you did it wrong, and then try and make things more inclusive next time around, and just keep doing that, and always be in that process of trying to improve, trying to bring more people into the fold rather than finding ways to exclude people, which is just, hopefully for the listeners of this, that's also, we're an inclusive bunch, or at least we want to be.
Try to be. All right. So I think we're all done.
I think we're all done.
We've been going the whole as long as we've been going, I think we're ready to call it a day and move on.
All right. Thanks for
sharing.
It's always
nice to sharing my wisdom. I was going to say thank you for participating in this scatterbrained brain dump session about accessibility.
Right. This is two ADHD guys talk about accessibility, right? But there you go.
Yeah, proof is in the pudding, as they say, I guess.
It pays the bills because we make so much money off this podcast. Donations are accepted.
Thank you all for listening, and we'll check in with you next time.
All right. Bye, Steve.
See ya.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.